Good morning. Welcome to Sunday School. I'm Mike Stedham. I'm the regular teacher for the Genesis class here at First United Methodist Church of Anniston. I also have the privilege of teaching the Carré class once a month. And for the last couple of weeks, I've been able to give you these Sunday School lessons here online. And thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate all the very kind comments that you've made about this. And I hope this is one way of holding us together during these very trying times, the times when I know you would really like to be in this beautiful sanctuary worshiping God, and we would really like to have you down here, but stay home, stay safe. You can be assured nobody is within 6 feet of me now. We're keeping our good social distance just as we're supposed to, and that's a very important thing. So today's lesson, we're going to talk about the crucifixion of Christ. We're in the book of Mark, and today we're going to be in the 15th chapter of the book of Mark, and we'll be talking about the events that happened during Good Friday. Now, of course, today, Palm Sunday, the beginning of the Christian Holy Week, the time that we commemorate, we remember all the events that happened to Jesus from his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Palm Sunday, when people were waving the palms at him, leading up to the crucifixion, which happened on Good Friday. Now, for many years, I never really understood why we called a day when this horrible, terrible, sad thing happened Good Friday. Where does this even come from? Well, the word good in ancient times had a slightly different meaning. It had an additional meaning of something that was holy or pious. In the same way we talk about the good book when we talk about the Bible. Well, in that same sense of holy, that's where we get the word good for Good Friday. So even though the things we commemorate, in no way would we describe them in our more common vernacular of the word good, that's why we call this Good Friday. So we're going to pick up the lesson today following the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Remember that Jesus has been captured, he's been taken away, he's been led away, and he's been tried by Herod and also by Pilate. Pilate being the Roman governor at the time, Pilate is actually the one who has the authority to issue a death sentence. Now remember, the nation of Israel really isn't a nation during the time of Christ. It's basically just a little small subset of an area that's been conquered and ruled by the Romans. The Romans are the government. They make all the big decisions, and they're the ones who have the authority to actually pronounce capital punishment, the punishment against somebody who's seen as an enemy of the state. And the form of death that we're going to talk about today, the crucifixion, didn't actually originate with the Romans. It goes back further, back to the Persians, and some other cultures have mention of it. But the Romans have certainly taken this particular method of execution, and they have taken it to another level of cruelty, another level of humiliation. And those are a couple of the themes that we're going to look at that Mark talks about in his gospel as he relates the story to us. Now, of course, Mark is the shortest gospel. We believe it was the first one written. It's the one that has a lot of the action in it. The Gospel of Mark, if you ever read through it, is constantly going through one thing happens immediately after another. That's the kind of narrative that Mark gives us. And so we're going to read his narration, his story of the crucifixion. And it begins just after, as I said, just after the trial before Pilate. And Pilate has decided to allow Jesus to be crucified. And so we're going to go now to the 15th chapter of the book of Mark. Jesus has appeared before Pilate, and today we're going to begin reading with the 16th verse of the 15th chapter. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. Now, we don't know exactly how many people were being crucified. We know of at least 3 people that are being taken away at this time. Why it would take an entire company of soldiers? Obviously, this is the Roman way of doing what they were going to do here. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. Now, purple, of course, is a color that indicates royalty, and a crown, of course, is something that indicates somebody who is to be honored, a leader. The Romans, as I said, used the form of crucifixion largely as a way to humiliate the person who is being crucified. And it is the sarcasm, the irony that the Roman soldiers are showing here that just amplifies the physical cruelty that goes along. So we have these two things happening. Jesus is being tortured physically, and if you've ever heard a medical doctor talk about the effects of crucifixion, this form of death was incredibly painful, very slow. It was intended to be that way. And the humiliation is only adding a further level of psychological pain to the physical pain that the victim would have. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now, this was a specific crime that Jesus had been accused of. He was accused of setting himself up as a political leader in direct opposition to Caesar. Now, the Romans were very picky about this. The Romans, when they conquered a land, they would let them have some local governance there. But primarily, the actual ruler was going to be Caesar. And that's the one that the people had to give their obedience to. This, again, a way of subjugating the people that they had conquered. So for somebody to claim this political title, King of the Jews, would have been seen as a form of treason for the Romans. And so the soldiers were told, certainly by their leaders, to go ahead and mock him in this way. Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. So the first part, again, the physical pain, the physical part. The second part, the humiliation, the sarcasm, that they would bow down to him as they would bow down to a king, which, of course, again, was intended to try to make this person feel humiliated. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Now, one of the things about crucifixion, as I mentioned a moment ago, it was a form of torture, it was a form of humiliation, and it was a form of exposure. The Romans normally would crucify people with no clothes on. Now, we believe, we know that in the Hebrew tradition, even when a person was being stoned, a man was allowed to wear a loincloth. There was a little scrap of modesty left to them even during the execution. And of course, all of our visual images of Christ, at least he has given that last shred of dignity. And we believe that his clothes were put back on him at the time of the crucifixion, as it says here. But in every other way, the crucifixion, the holding out of the body, the putting the person up on a pole so that passersby can see him and ridicule him, all this is just meant to compound the psychological torture that the victim would be going through. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way and home from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Now we know Jesus had been undergoing beatings, floggings, for several hours even before he was taken before Herod and before Pilate. So his physical condition had to have been very bad at this point. A lot of blood loss, a lot of torture. He was not doing well, and the image that we all have is of him not even being able to carry the cross. Now, historians tell us that the way the Romans did the crucifixion, the vertical pole would have been left in place. They had this on Golgotha, the place of the skull. They had a lot of these, and the prisoner would be carrying the cross beam that would be placed up on top there, and their hands either tied or nailed to that. So Jesus was probably at first forced to carry this very large log of wood, and of course very heavy. And his physical condition, it might have been physically impossible for him to do it. So the soldiers grabbed this man, this Simon, and forced him to carry this for Jesus. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Now, where Golgotha is, some historians tell us it's the northern part of Jerusalem. There are places that claim to be the actual site. It means the place of the skull. And some historians have speculated that the shape of the land might have indicated a skull. There might have been some indentations that looked like the eye sockets on a skull. We don't really know where this place is. This is, again, one of those biblical locations that people make claims, this is it, that is it. It's been more than 2,000 years, and people don't really know exactly where these places are. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And again, historians tell us that this wine and this myrrh, this spice, was sometimes used as an analgesic. In other words, it was intended to help dull some of the pain. This probably was given to these victims, the people being crucified, as a way to prolong their time, their torture up on the cross. Jesus refuses to take it. Jesus is not going to have anything to cloud his perception as he's going through this particular time. And then they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see which would get each. So they had to decide who's going to get this. Now imagine, Jesus at this time, we believe, is about 33, 34 years old. He's lived, in those days, would have been considered a fairly full life, actually. And all he has, his entire earthly possessions, literally the clothes on his back. That's the only thing physically they could take from him in terms of possessions. And the soldiers, by the way, it was quite common for them to be able to divide the spoils. That was part of this extra special duty pay for the people who were on the crucifixion detail. It was the third hour when they crucified him. That's the Roman way of saying it was about 9 o'clock in the morning. 6 o'clock in the morning, sunrise, that's the first hour. The third hour is around 9 o'clock, and we'll see some of those others later. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Now, we believe that the prisoners who were forced to march on their way up to Golgotha were often forced to carry signs telling the public what they had done wrong, what was the point of this. And once they were up on the cross, they would put this above their head so that passers-by would see, oh, this person was a traitor, an insurrectionist. This person was a murderer, something that had earned them the death penalty under Roman law. This was a deterrent, really. That's the reason the Romans did it that way. They wanted people not to do these things, and so they put these signs up to indicate if you murder somebody, if you try to start a revolt, this is the kind of punishment you're going to get. They crucified two robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Now, Mark doesn't go into the discussions between them, the story that is covered in the book of Luke. We don't have that exchange here. All we really know is that he is in the midst of these people who probably did more than just rob, because robbery or theft by itself was not necessarily a capital crime. They may have been insurrectionists as well as Barabbas, the prisoner who was released in Jesus' place. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." Well, this is interesting because Jesus never said that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Where did this even come from? Jesus had made a comment earlier in his ministry that if they were to destroy this temple, he was referring to his body, that it would be back in 3 days. He was prophesying his resurrection. It's interesting, isn't it, how when people want to think something bad about another person, they take what they say and they twist it. Jesus didn't say these things, but the common people had heard something about a temple, about destruction, about 3 days, and so they conflated those things together and made it into this particular statement, which Jesus never said. In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him, among others. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So basically, Jesus is up here being tortured physically. His life is being taken away by the cruel physical effects of the crucifixion, and the people around him are throwing insults at him. So what was Jesus thinking? Now, for 2,000 years or more, we've been asking this question. What's going through Jesus' mind during this time of crucifixion? Why is all this happening? What's going on? Well, Brenda and I often talk about these verses before I teach the Sunday school class, and we were having a discussion this week, and she gave me a really important insight, I believe, into these verses. Basically, throughout Jesus' entire earthly ministry, everything we know about Jesus, every day when he got up to go out into the public and do what he did, his focus was always on other people. We don't see Jesus taking time out to do things for Jesus. He's out there doing things for the people around him. As I said, his only possessions at this point, the clothes that he wears. A couple of weeks ago when we talked about the temptations of Christ, each of those temptations basically would be a way for him to take the easy way out instead of serving the people and doing something for himself. He was tempted to do that at the beginning of his ministry. He didn't. And it seems odd to me that he would be thinking about only himself, that he would completely change his personality at this time. So obviously, he's still thinking about others, about his mission. What's the purpose of what he's doing? These people who say, "Go ahead, Jesus, save yourself," obviously that would have been tempting, because we believe in the supernatural power of Jesus, that he could have put a stop to these things, but he didn't. There's a purpose for this. Jesus is not focusing on himself, but he is focusing on humanity. Paul tells us he's taken all the sins of all the human beings ever on himself. So at this time, this is the most selfless action we can imagine. So Jesus is not focusing on his own personal pain, suffering, all these things, but instead he's focusing on humanity and the job that he has to do for all of us. At the 6th hour, this would have been noon on the Roman time scheme, at the 6th hour came over the whole land a darkness, and lasted till the 9th hour. So this is a supernatural darkness. This is the sun hiding its face, something that made it appear that something unpleasant, something terrible is happening. At the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is the 9th hour. This is around 3 p.m., and this is now getting on towards the end of the time. Jesus' physical body is wearing out. The torture it's gone through, the blood loss, all these things have taken their toll. And so he calls out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And these words, of course, ring down through the ages. People ask, why would he say this? Well, where do these words even come from? Well, these are the very first words of the 22nd Psalm. And certainly these words by themselves sound like somebody who is completely abandoned, left alone. God has turned away. If you read the 22nd Psalm, and this will be your reading assignment for the week before Easter, read the 22nd Psalm. It's one of those psalms that begins in total despair. The psalmist at first wonders where God is, but then the psalm, if you read the whole thing, is quite a psalm of consolation, of hope, because the psalmist realizes that God takes care of people. God takes care of the universe. God has not abandoned God's creation. And also, as you read these verses, read the 22nd Psalm, you'll notice so many parallels between what the psalmist describes and what's actually going on in Jesus' life at that very moment. So it's an interesting parallel to read that. Jesus was steeped in the words of the Hebrew Bible, the Psalms. A couple of weeks ago, we saw how many of the verses he could quote. He knew this backwards and forwards, or and since it was Hebrew, forwards and backwards. And he knew all of these verses. He knew what was going on, and these verses are the ones that he chooses to focus on, to remember at this time in his life. And so I think we have to look at this not just at the first couple of words of the psalm, but look at the entire psalm, and I think you'll get the deeper meaning here. When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." And again, the tradition was that Elijah was going to come before the Messiah, and I guess the word Eloi, Eloi, and Elijah, they begin sort of the same way, and some people might not have been listening that carefully and may have misunderstood it. One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Now, a lot of people read this and think it must have been a cry of agony, a cry of pain, a cry of the end. Now, we don't have the word spoken here. The other Gospels tell us that basically what Jesus has said after this is, "It is finished." And the way we know that this must not have been a cry of agony, but more a cry of success, a cry of victory, comes from what happens next. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now this curtain, we believe, is the curtain that separated the holy place inside the temple from the holy of the holies, the very holiest place in there, the place that the priests could only go once a year to perform the sacrifice. This was a curtain that separated humans from the divine. And we believe in our Christian theology that Jesus' death is what tears down the barrier that had existed between humans and God, the barrier that was put up through our sin, the sin of Adam, the sin of all humanity, that barrier was torn. And it was torn from top to bottom. God destroyed it, not from bottom to top as if a human being had done it. So that is one part of the victory that Jesus had here. And the second part, "And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, 'Surely this man was the Son of God.'" Now, one of our class members, Dan Brown, for years and years has done this wonderful program on being the centurion. He's brought so much insight into all of us about how these centurions did this. This was not this centurion's first crucifixion. This was certainly not the first person this centurion ever witnessed dying. This centurion may well have seen his own soldiers die. He may have seen enemy soldiers die. He has seen people die in crucifixion. No telling how many different deaths this man has witnessed as part of his job as being a Roman centurion. He recognized something in what Jesus said, how he said it, how this cry came out, that convinced him, somebody who certainly is not a Christian, was not a Jew, had no background in the Jewish faith, had no background in the whole monotheistic notion here, that this person was the Son of God. Something profound happened. Now, we have apocryphal stories about what happened to that centurion later. None of that's recorded in the Bible. We don't know how it affected his life, but he saw something in that death that indicated to him that this was something different. This was something out of the ordinary. This was something special. Well, that's where today's text ends, but there's just a little coda here that I want to get to. The next couple of verses are really interesting to me. "Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with them to Jerusalem were also there. So often, we ignore the role of women in the gospel. They were the ones who, even though they had to remain at a distance in the crowd here, were the ones who followed Jesus. Most of the disciples, the male followers of Jesus, had scattered. They were frightened off by the Romans. They were afraid for their own lives. But these women, they're the ones who follow. And there's a clear indication, at least an implication here, that the gospel writer Mark may have gotten some of this material from the women who actually saw what happened. So as far as eyewitness accounts of the crucifixion, this is as close as we're going to get. These are the people who may have talked to him about it. They were certainly there. They were the ones who loved Jesus enough, who were loyal enough to Jesus to be there even at the time when other people had abandoned him. Well, I hope the Sunday school lesson has helped you a little bit. I know we have a lot to do this week as far as getting ready for Easter. Of course, we'll all have to do it at home. We won't be able to come to the church and do the usual things that we normally do down here, but there's a lot of very special things that will be happening during the week, and we hope to see you back soon. Thanks for watching today.